Hello and welcome back to the Alnwick Castle Podcast. I'm Daniel Watkins.
And I'm Deborah Beecroft.
And today's episode is about Alnwick Castle's connections to two of the most important women of the Tudor period, Anne Boleyn and her daughter, Queen Elizabeth I.
On Saturday the 19th of August, historian Tracy Borman will be appearing at Alnwick Castle to talk about her new book, Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I, the mother and daughter who changed history. You can still book tickets for this event from our website, alnwickcastle.com, and we hope you can join us for what's sure to be a fascinating evening.
As a preview for the event, this episode of the podcast will look at how Anne and Elizabeth changed the fortunes of the Percy family, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. We'll also be giving our thoughts on Tracy Borman's book.
Please enjoy.
So in advance of the event coming up this August, both Deborah and I have read Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I, the mother and daughter who changed history.
Keep going.
It's a book that uses all kinds of new archival sources and references to look at the story of these two queens in a different way than you normally would get. Is that something that struck you about the book when you were reading it?
Yes. So it splits the book almost into two. So it goes through how Anne Boleyn was perceived, how she became Queen of England, but also focuses on how much of her life before she became Queen was interested in things like the Reformation and the changes in religious ideas that were coming through the time, which is not usually the case. Often it's how that changed because of the lack of divorce from Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. But it tells you a bit more of who she was before she became Queen. And then from there, it moves to Elizabeth and how much of what she did, or maybe how much of what she did, was influenced on what happened to her mother and how that had affected her growing up without a mother since she was 2.
Yeah,
and how much of an influence Anne was going through her life. And sometimes it was quite small influences, and sometimes it was pieces of clothing that she wore and things like that. So it's quite nice to sort of see how Anne was influencing Elizabeth, which doesn't usually come across in books. It's more of how her father was the dominant parent because he was at least alive for a lot of it. Yeah. Whereas this one is very much how Anne influenced her daughter even after she died so much earlier.
Yeah, that seems to be the aim of the book. One of the quotes that stuck in my mind was that Tracy Borman is trying to piece together the intertwining threads of these two lives. And you get a lot of books that look at Anne Boleyn, you get a lot of books that look at Elizabeth I, but I really got an impression of how connected they were to each other, even though they barely knew each other in person. Obviously, Anne not alive for long enough to really get that effect, but even when Elizabeth was the baby, they didn't really see each other.
No, because within weeks of Elizabeth being born, she was moved to a new household as the heir, so immediately she was moved away from her mother.
Yeah, that's something I didn't really know very much about, but it was a Tudor royal tradition. Once a royal baby is born, they get set up in their own household and they are apart from their parents.
Yeah.
And that seems to have been something that really affected Elizabeth later on. She never got the chance to know her mother for one reason, and then Anne's death.
Yeah, what I found interesting later on is when Elizabeth becomes queen, how much of her household and her favourites and the people that she kept close were all from the Boleyn side of the family. So whether it was uncles or aunts or cousins, it was that family that she would keep close to her, which was quite interesting to see that it wasn't the Tudors and the royal family, it was Anne's family that she trusted.
Definitely, almost like she's trying to maintain this connection that she couldn't make with Anne herself.
Yeah.
I think it's probably fair to say that it's given us a bit of a new perspective looking into these two Tudor women's lives. Yeah,
and like I say, it was a lot of things that I didn't necessarily know, even though I've read a lot of books with Anne Boleyn or Elizabeth I, and obviously there's a lot of TV and films with these characters in, but what I found most interesting was Anne before she became queen, when she was still in France, and how she would read books or poems of women authors, but also within the French court, because they were a little bit more free in how they educated women and things like that, and how much that influenced her and how when Elizabeth then became queen, whether it was the authors or the people Anne had met in the French court, she would then have a connection to them and speak to them and read their novels or pamphlets or whatever. And it was quite interesting to see how much of Anne's life before she became to England was in the book, which I didn't really know much about.
So much of Anne's story tends to start with her relationship with Henry VIII.
Yeah.
And it goes from there. But there's a whole life before that I think Tracy Borman gets into in a really interesting way. And you can see the effect that it has on her relationships, on her as a mother, on her as a member of the court, and as a religious reformer.
Yeah, that was the bit that I found the most interesting, the things that she had read and what she was practicing and supporting in terms of the reforming of the church long before there was any of that in England. It was partly because of being in France, it was a bit more prevalent, but also it meant that you could understand a little bit more of where she was coming from in the Reformation in England, because she was already supporting that. It wasn't a result of what was coming. There
was an interesting little connection to Percy history in that as well. Before we get into that, we're going to tell you now the story of Anne Boleyn's connections with Alnwick Castle and with the Percy family. And we'll be back with some more book thoughts after you've heard that story from us.
Henry Percy, who would later be known as the 6th Earl of Northumberland, was born in 1502. The son of the 5th Earl, who had the nickname Henry the Magnificent, the young Henry was sent to the household of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey to be educated, serving as a pupil and a personal attendant to the Cardinal. Wolsey was chief advisor to King Henry VIII and a key part of the King's court. For the heir to the Earldom of Northumberland, being a part of Wolsey's household was the best possible introduction to court life and excellent preparation for his future role.
When he was around 20 years old, Henry Percy's duties included attending on Wolsey at court. While the Cardinal and the King discussed affairs of state in private, Percy passed his time in the apartments of the Queen, Catherine of Aragon. According to Percy family historians, it was here where he would indulge in dalliance with Her Majesty's ladies-in-waiting.
One of these ladies was apparently Anne Boleyn, who Henry was said to have fallen in love with. We don't know the full extent of their relationship, but Percy historians claim Anne was offered Percy's hand in marriage. If this happened, it would have been a clear display of his romantic feelings for her, but it was a gesture he had made without first gaining the approval of his father, the Cardinal, or the King. When the relationship was brought to the knowledge of Henry VIII, he requested that Wolsey put a stop to Percy's ideas of marrying Anne. An eyewitness claimed Wolsey returned from court to his house at Westminster, called Henry Percy to him, and said,
"I marvel not a little of your folly, that you would thus attempt to assure yourself with a foolish girl yonder in the court, Anne Boleyn. Do you not consider the estate that God has called you unto in this world? For after your father's death, you are most like to inherit and enjoy one of the noblest earldoms in this kingdom. And therefore it would have been most convenient for you to have had your father's consent in this case, and to have acquainted the King's Majesty for a matter requiring his princely favour. But now see what you have done. Through your wilfulness, you have not only offended your father, but also your loving sovereign lord, and matched yourself with such a one as neither the king nor your father will consent unto. And here I put you out of doubt that I will send for your father, who at his coming shall either break this unadvised bargain or else disinherit you forever. The King's Majesty will also complain to your father and require no less than I have said."
According to this eyewitness, Percy, who was in tears, replied,
"Sir, I knew not the King's pleasure, and am sorry for it. I considered I am of good years, and thought myself able to provide me a convenient wife, as my fancy should please me, not doubting but that my lord and father would have been right well content. Anne Boleyn is descended of right noble blood and parentage. Therefore I most humbly beseech your grace's favour, and also to entreat the King's Majesty on my behalf for his princely favour in this matter, which I cannot forsake."
The Cardinal responded,
"What wisdom is in this wilful boy's head? I thought that when you heard the King's pleasure, you would have relented and put yourself and your voluptuous act wholly to the King's will and pleasure."
Percy then said,
"Sir, so I would, but in this matter I have gone so far before so many worthy witnesses that I know not how to discharge myself and my conscience."
The Cardinal stated that he and the King knew what to do to resolve the matter, at which point Percy submitted himself to their will. Wolsey told him in the meantime,
"I charge you that you resort no more into her company,"
as to do so would anger the King. A meeting was then arranged between the 5th Earl of Northumberland and his son. The eyewitness reported what the Earl supposedly said to young Henry at the meeting.
"Son, even as you have been, and always were, a proud, licentious, and unthrifty waster, so have you now declared yourself. Having neither regard unto me, your natural father, nor yet to the king, your natural sovereign lord, to whom all honest and loyal subjects bear faithful obedience, nor to the wealth of your own estate, you have unadvisedly assured yourself unto her. The king is highly displeased with you, whose displeasure is intolerable for any subject to bear. His indignation could ruin me utterly. I assure you that if you do not amend your prodigality, you will be the last earl of our house, for of your natural inclination you are wasteful, and will continue to waste all that our progenitors have with great care and travel gathered and kept together with honour. To tell you true, I intend not to make you my heir, for I thank God I have more boys that I trust will prove much better than you."
Percy was also reminded that he already had a pre-contract of marriage to Lady Mary Talbot, the daughter of the Earl and Countess of Shrewsbury. If these eyewitness reports are accurate, they suggest Percy had a strong attachment to Anne and had at least considered the idea of marriage to her. Other sources, however, argue that their relationship was never more than a brief flirtation and was only made to seem more serious and intimate years later, when it was of public importance and royal convenience for that to have been the case.
The result of these meetings and conversations was the enforced end of any contact between Percy and Anne. Soon afterwards, he was married to Mary Talbot and banished from the court. He returned to Northumberland to fight Scottish border raiders, and the fear of displeasing his father again became the dominating factor in his life. He tried his hardest to forget Anne Boleyn. A 19th century historian wrote, "Thus passed away the one gleam of sunshine that ever brightened the sad life of Henry Percy."
In 1527, when Henry was 25 years old, his father died. The fifth Earl's threat was not followed through, and his son became the Earl of Northumberland, with Mary becoming Countess. The absence of Henry the Magnificent did not allow the new sixth Earl any more freedom, however. He now found himself controlled by Cardinal Wolsey, who frequently scolded him for his extravagance and wastefulness. Before his own death in 1530, Wolsey took control of Percy finances and threatened to take over the management of his lands and estates. He even received secret reports from spies, one of whom was later imprisoned in the Auditor's Tower of Alnwick Castle. Percy's marriage to Mary Talbot was an unhappy one. They were reported to have frequent arguments, one of which ended with Percy telling Mary she was not his true wife, that he had been betrothed to Anne Boleyn, and as a consequence of that pre-contract, their marriage was illegal. Mary took this matter to her father, who then reported it to the Duke of Norfolk, Anne Boleyn's uncle. Anne was now the subject of a potential scandal, and chose to confront the accusation. She demanded that the king launch a strict inquiry into her relationship with Percy. He was summoned to appear before a council in 1533, where he denied the charge and voluntarily swore an oath to the Archbishop of Canterbury that there had never been any pre-contract or promise of marriage between himself and Anne. This seemed to finalise the matter for a few years. By 1536, Anne Boleyn had risen to the position of Henry VIII's wife and queen, given birth to her daughter Elizabeth, and then fallen to the status of a prisoner awaiting trial for a variety of alleged crimes. Her tribunal took place in front of 26 male peers. Each of these men would have been expected to follow the king's wishes and proclaim Anne guilty of everything she'd been accused of. One of the peers was the 6th Earl of Northumberland.
While he followed royal command and sat at the tribunal, according to an ambassador from Venice who was present at the time, Percy was obliged by a sudden illness to leave the court. This may have been a genuine illness, but perhaps he could not bear to be directly responsible for condemning Anne to death. The heartbroken Earl's absence did not save her, as she was still found guilty. In the Tower of London, awaiting her execution, Anne is said to have confessed to certain lawful impediments to her marriage with the king. Some believe this to have been a reference to Percy, who wrote to the royal minister Thomas Cromwell on the 13th of May, 1536, to reiterate his denial of any pre-contract. Henry wished to assure Cromwell, "By the said oath and blessed body, which I received, and hereafter intend to receive, that the same may be to my damnation, if ever there was any contract or promise of marriage between her and me."
This was the last word on the subject of his relationship with Anne Boleyn. A year after she was beheaded, the 6th Earl of Northumberland died. Neither lived beyond their mid-30s.
So that was the story of Anne Boleyn and the 6th Earl of Northumberland. as you'll get the sense of if you read the Tracy Borman book, Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I, the 6th Earl of Northumberland is just a little part of Anne Boleyn's story, but I think she was a major part of his life.
Yeah, and it's when we talk about the 6th Earl, we talk about him in relation to her. That's generally how, when it comes to a 2-hour talk, that's how we always perceive it, that she was a big part of his life and leading up to his death.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a reversal of a lot of Anne Boleyn's stories that put her as a part of Henry VIII's story.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that this book by Tracy Borman does really well. It puts Anne at the foreground, and the king really is in the background of what she was going through as an individual.
Yes, probably no more than talking about Elizabeth as a child.
Yes.
Because it's almost, it explains the story of when Anne Boleyn was pregnant, that the French king was ready to be godfather, there was ready to be fireworks and big displays, and then the second that they realised it was a girl and not a boy, all of that was cancelled, whereas Anne kept Elizabeth close to her for as long as possible until she had to leave to create her own household. But it's very much the mother and daughter story, not the disappointment of the king.
The way that the book talks about pregnancy and childbirth and motherhood is really interesting. So Anne's coronation, she was about to give birth to Elizabeth.
Yes. So she was, Anne was already pregnant with Elizabeth when she became queen. And that then followed through Elizabeth's life, as she was seen to be illegitimate regardless of whether people supported her as queen or not. And she had this hanging over her head the whole time, which was quite interesting because, again, you often read about how people didn't support her because she was a Protestant queen as opposed to a Catholic queen like her sister Mary I or the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots. And that was true of some people, but actually other people didn't necessarily agree she was queen because Anne had been pregnant before the marriage of her and Henry VIII. Yeah. So Anne was heavily pregnant at her coronation, but she wanted to show the world her purity. So within the coronation itself, there were a lot of symbolisms, whether towards the Virgin Mary or to purity. She was in white, her hair was down, and this was symbols of that. And she wanted to outwardly show that she was like the Virgin Mary. She said that the room that she gave birth in was called the Chamber of Virgins. So anything that she could show to the outside world that Elizabeth was legitimate.
The legitimacy of Elizabeth is a big thing throughout the book. It's something that, again, I didn't really realise followed her throughout her life. So despite Anne trying to do all of this at her coronation, outwardly, to people looking, she did not look necessarily pure because she was...
No, she was very heavily pregnant. Whereas at Elizabeth's coronation, she used a lot of the same symbols as her mother, again, possibly to show that connection to the Boleyn's side of the family and to show that her mother was Queen of England. So Elizabeth was also wearing white, had the hair down, but she wasn't pregnant.
No.
And she made a big show of this, I suppose is the word. Yeah. She wanted to show people that she was pure, that she was the Virgin Queen that she would become. And what was quite interesting is Tracy Borman explains why the Virgin Queen was such an important symbol to Elizabeth, possibly because of everything that had come through regarding her legitimacy, regarding her mother, and the idea that she wasn't the real queen. She really wanted to show that she was, but also the trauma of her mother having a child that was a daughter, the trauma of childbirth itself. This was a lot of the ideas that seemed to have come through the book of why then Elizabeth wanted to show the world she was the Virgin Queen.
Even the build-up to childbirth, the idea of is it a laying-in room or a laying-in chamber where you are closed off from the entire world, it seems like not the most friendly, welcoming kind of way to give birth to a potential heir to the throne, but that's something that Anne had to go through. It's something Elizabeth seems to have been afraid of having to go through. Yeah. Tracy Borman talks about fear with Elizabeth quite a lot, which again is not how you'd normally see her presented.
No. Well, that was it, that when you were a royal child, the mother went into a room, all the windows were closed, tapestries went over the windows, everything was dark, and you could only have the few ladies in waiting with you, midwives. It wasn't particularly a calming effect, I would imagine.
No. But this is what Anne was expecting to have to go through, I suppose. And to go through all of that and then have the child taken away from you almost straight away, it seems like it's something Anne didn't quite want to happen. She wanted to keep Elizabeth with her as much as possible, and did get to see her occasionally, at least.
And it was mentioned as well, whether it was to do with people going across and taking Elizabeth's new clothes, and even sort of some of the last documents that are mentioned in this book from Anne Boleyn's life are about clothing Elizabeth, and that was quite interesting.
The clothes are a really interesting bit. The idea that Anne was picking out clothes for Elizabeth, and then when you get into the second part of the book about Elizabeth as the queen and how important clothing and how she dressed was throughout her whole reign, how she presented herself, how she appeared in portraits. Again, it's like you're saying, it's linking her back to her mum and not to her dad.
Yes, because even some of the dresses that she wore, some of which are in portraits that are in the book as well, the imagery on the dresses are to do with the Boleyn side, or to do with the symbolism of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn's marriage, which people may have known, people may not have known, but Elizabeth knew, and it was important to her to show that into her portraits. There's a couple of portraits which have very similar jewellery to portraits of Anne Boleyn, particularly with the dropped pearls, that the very famous Boleyn necklace. Those are in Elizabeth's portraits, and again, that was, people would have probably known these were the Boleyn side.
Yeah, and it's a relationship that, even though it ended well before she was queen, it affected her throughout her entire time in charge of the country.
Yeah.
And we're going to take a break from talking about the book to talk more about Elizabeth I.
Here are the stories of Earls and Countesses of Northumberland with links to Elizabeth I, the second subject of the book and one of England's most famous monarchs.
During Elizabeth's 45-year reign as queen, the fortunes of the Percy family here at Alnwick Castle rose and fell and rose again. You can hear about the rebellion against Elizabeth that led to the beheading of the 7th Earl of Northumberland and the exile of his Countess Anne in episode 30 of the podcast. The 7th Earl's successor was his brother Henry, who had showed loyalty to the Queen almost from the very beginning of her reign. He was one of the commanders of the English army that advanced into Scotland in 1560 to attack a French garrison stationed at Leith. He then took part in negotiations for the peace treaty that saw Mary, Queen of Scots, agree to recognise Elizabeth I as Queen of England, and he was himself summoned for a personal interview with Elizabeth. As Sheriff of Northumberland, he remained loyal to the crown even as his brother and sister-in-law rebelled against it. He helped to make sure that the county stayed peaceful during the Northern Rebellion. Only a tiny percentage of the rebels came from Northumberland. When the uprising failed, Henry did nothing to help the 7th Earl and Countess, but we don't know why he chose loyalty to the Queen over his brother. It may have been religious differences, political considerations, or his own personal reasons. Elizabeth took notice of him, however, and in November 1569 she wrote to him and said,
"As we have always had an assured good opinion of your fidelity towards our estate, and a special devotion towards ourselves, so we are very glad to understand, as we do at this time, of your constancy and forwardness in our service, although the same be against your brother. Considering your fidelity to us, we would have you well assured that, continuing your service and duty, we will have regard to the continuance of such a house in the person and blood of so faithful a servant as we trust to find you."
Elizabeth considered Henry a better, more faithful choice than his brother to be Earl of Northumberland. But by the end of 1571, he'd been arrested, suspected of being involved in the Ridolfi plot, a Catholic attempt backed by the Pope and led by Italian banker Roberto Ridolfi to replace the Queen with Mary, Queen of Scots. We don't know how involved in the plot Percy actually was, but in February 1572 he was tried, found guilty, and fined £5,000. Unlike his brother, he kept his head and was still allowed to inherit the earldom after the 7th Earl's beheading that summer. Henry was not released from the Tower of London until the following May, probably due to non-payment of the fine, and a condition of his release was that he did not live in the north. Instead, he had to stay in the family home at Petworth in West Sussex.
In the following decade, he seems to have remained in Elizabeth's favour. He and his Countess, Catherine Neville, regularly appear in the lists of donors and recipients of royal New Year's gifts between 1577 and 1583. These were gifts given to the monarch, as well as gifts from the monarch. But the 8th Earl must still have been regarded with some level of suspicion, as Elizabeth's agents continued to monitor him. In the 1580s, he was arrested and sent to the Tower again, this time in connection with what is known as the Throckmorton plot. There did not appear to be enough evidence for him to be put on trial, but he remained a prisoner anyway. In June 1585, the 8th Earl of Northumberland was found dead in his cell under mysterious circumstances. He was officially ruled to have killed himself, but it has often been suspected that he was murdered. We'll be talking about the strange death of the 8th Earl in a future episode of the podcast.
His son, another Henry, then took over the earldom at the age of 21. This Henry, who became known as the Wizard Earl, was in favour with Elizabeth I in the first years of his earldom. She made him a Knight of the Garter in 1593.
Like his father, he regularly appears among the donors and recipients of royal New Year's gifts. Percy's gifts to the Queen were often beautiful pieces of jewellery. In 1589, he gave her one jewel of gold like a lamp, garnished with sparks of diamonds and one opal. In 1599, he gave her a jewelled collar or necklace of gold containing 9 square pieces, 4 pendants like half moons, garnished with sparks of diamonds, rubies and pearls threaded between. In return, the Queen generally gave 20 to 30 ounces of gilt plate.
Unlike a lot of his Percy predecessors, the 9th Earl did not have a long military career. He served in campaigns in the Netherlands at the very end of Elizabeth's reign, but the most notable thing that happened to him there was the duel he almost took part in with Francis Vere, commander of the English forces. That duel was only stopped by the Queen's intervention. He did, however, nearly get involved in a rebellion. His wife Dorothy's brother was the Earl of Essex, a favourite of Elizabeth I, who attempted to rebel against her in 1601. Essex was executed, but despite being his brother-in-law, by that time Percy no longer had a close association with him.
At the very end of Elizabeth's life, the Wizard Earl was one of her personal attendants during her last royal progress in 1602. He wrote at the time, "Wednesday night the Queen was not well, but would not be known of it. For the next day she walked abroad in the park, lest any should take notice of it." Percy had also been in secret correspondence with King James VI of Scotland, promising loyalty if James succeeded to the English throne when Elizabeth died. Although one pamphlet from 1600 names the 9th Earl in a list of potential successors to the Queen, he does not seem to have had any great desire to take the crown for himself. When Elizabeth I died in 1603, Henry's brother Charles Percy was appointed to be the person to take the news of her death to James in Edinburgh, but he was beaten by a few hours by another messenger.
So, through 45 years, Elizabeth I had a pretty strong effect on the Percy family here at Alnwick Castle, really right up until the moment of her death. But she had a huge effect on the country as well, and a lot of that, as Tracy Borman explains in the book, is because she never got married.
Yes, and I think what's interesting in how Tracy Borman explores it is that with the rules of a Tudor marriage, that as soon as you're married, the husband is in charge.
Yes.
He gets all of your land, and if you do have any money, anything like that, it's now his, and as well as yourself, you are his property. And what was explored in this book is how Elizabeth, as Queen of England, was ready to lose a lot more if she ever got married, because she had not just estates, money, everything else, she also had the kingdom.
Yes. And it's balancing being a queen with being a woman. In Tudor England, even if you are the queen, that was a difficult obstacle for her to overcome. And it seems like, looking at the influence of her stepmothers and her birth mother, Anne Boleyn, did help Elizabeth to figure out how to overcome that balance.
Yeah, so Tracy Borman says is that the way Elizabeth I ruled was very similar to how Anne was ruling, which is quite surprising in the fact that she never met her mother, really.
Yeah.
She wouldn't have known her. It would have been the other wives possibly that she knew better, particularly Catherine Parr, who she lived with for a period of time. But she would also have seen how her sister, Mary I, ruled.
Yes.
And almost has gone against that way.
Because she did get married.
And
she did kind of let her husband take over a little bit.
Yes, exactly.
She was queen in her own right, but as a wife, he was in charge.
Yes.
Elizabeth doesn't have that.
No, but what Elizabeth did have was every single member of court telling her she should get married the whole time, and it's almost like she was the only person who thought that the best way for her to rule was not to.
And I think she was probably right in doing that.
Yes, I think so.
She was able to use the power of being the queen. She was able to use the power of being a woman at this time to combine the best of both those elements in a way I imagine her mother would have been quite proud of.
Yes. But what was interesting as well, although she is a woman and is using her feminine traits, she also knows when to use the masculine traits. So she's also calls herself a man or a king, but she also knows that sometimes there's a benefit for that, but sometimes her strength comes from the fact that she is a queen and a woman. And possibly this is true because the image that is often said of Elizabeth I is her at the site of the Armada, Spanish Armada, where she is saying that she might have the body of a feeble woman, but that is the striking image of her. So she's got that nice link between both sides of who she is.
Yeah, it's an aspect of Elizabeth that most people are familiar with, whether you're watching Cate Blanchett do it in a film, or you're reading a historical novel about Elizabeth, or even if it's Blackadder with Miranda Richardson talking about the heart and stomach of a concrete elephant. That's the impression that most people have of Elizabeth. I think what this book does is show how much of that wasn't the influence of her father. It was the strength she got from her mother and from the female intellectuals that Anne had heard about in her early life, who Elizabeth then read about herself.
Yeah.
So there's a really good connection running all the way through that.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you think you learned anything new about Elizabeth from this book? She's such a famous person in history. It's hard to find new things about her sometimes.
Yeah, I think rather than the actual historical information, it was possibly more where the links with her mother came into it, because again, that's not something that's necessarily explored, whether that's in fiction or non-fiction or TV or books or whatever. But having sort of those links to her mother's family, who she trusted because of that, all the sort of small symbols in the paintings, none of that's really something that's explored much of. And it was, rather than the actual historical details, those sort of small details that are in other things, more personal information, that's something that I didn't really know much of.
Yeah. And what's nice, just to finish off this talk about the book Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I, the mother and daughter who changed history, is that some of those emblems and some of those connections are actually part of our collection and our archive here at Alnwick Castle. We have a prayer book, and that prayer book was owned by Anne Boleyn, and it contains symbols and emblems that are associated with her, like the honeysuckle and the falcon of the Boleyn family, that the book shows are symbols and emblems that Elizabeth took and carried on using through her reign as well. So that little book in our archive is part of this whole big story.
And if you get the book, there's actually a small picture from that has been used, so you can actually see it in Tracy Borman's book.
We hope you enjoyed this look into our connections with Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I. If you'd like to buy tickets to our event with Tracy Borman on Saturday the 19th of August, please head to our website alnwickcastle.com to book now. Copies of the book Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I, the mother and daughter who changed history, will also be available on the night.
If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. We'll have more Tudor podcasts coming up in the future. We'd be grateful for any reviews or recommendations you can give to any history fans you know.
Join us again in 2 weeks when we'll be looking at the most recent film made at Alnwick Castle, Dungeons & Dragons: Honour Among Thieves. Until then, I've been Daniel.
And I've been Deborah.
Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.
Goodbye.